an amazing thing. We're actually starting on time. Usually church runs late and we're always late. And so we'll start on time. Well, welcome. I'm glad you were willing to hang around longer than usual for the seminar. Excited again. I missed part one from Daniel's seminar. I was unfortunately, I had to be in Portugal during that time. But I did log on and listen to the seminar, and I thought, part two was going to be on belief, different words. Oh, you'll tell them why it happened. Okay. Anyway, it's myth, as you see here, and I don't know if he's going to get to sin or not. But at least I guess we're starting with myth. I was interested in all these words we use, and they have meaning, but different meanings to different people. Some people, I think, use religious words, don't even really know what they mean, but it sounds good. I had a minister for 40 years. I was a Trinity Methodist person, and the person that built that church was Odine Martin. Started with a couple of hundred members when we got there, and when he died of brain cancer, it's 2,000 members. One of the things that bothered him a lot was people misusing religious language, covering everything with it. He referred to it as religious syrup. It drove him crazy to have people just cover stuff with religious syrup in their language. So it's part of my interest, and as turns out, Daniel's expert in words. I think at least he's thought a lot about them. Maybe I'll give you that. All right. And so we'll go ahead and start with myth.
Real good.
Thank you.
For those of you who were or were not with me when we started this little experiment, the first word we looked at was belief. And I had originally come to the whole idea of saying, let's look at belief and kind of define it and have a way of understanding it. And then I was going to move into faith as the second half of the seminar that day, and it turned out belief took up the whole time. And then when I was asked if I would do a second one, I think everybody assumed I was going to do faith. Chad assumed I was going to do faith. John thought I was going to do faith. But I thought, well, if I'm doing if we're doing two of these, I'm not doing number two, but if we are going to do more than one of these, why don't we sort of build something? And so when talking about belief, what we really came down to was, take the two words that originally made it up, by and life, and reverse them. And belief really means what you live by. It's ingrained in you, and it defines how you talk, act, think, what you live by. So I thought, well, that's a good one just to kind of have as a foundation. And then I thought, well, what other words, if we might build a sense of something, what are some other words that might be helpful as foundational? And so today I have two words, and I do think I will get to both of these today. The first one is myth, and we won't spend tons of time on that. But I am going to read, well, I may spend more time on it than I was thinking. So that's the first word we're going to look at. The second word, I thought I might as well say this so you have time to leave quietly if you want to. It's a word we use so often at UCG. But I thought, well, we probably need to get that one kind of under our belts as well. But let's start with the word myth. And very simply, a myth is a traditional story. It gets passed down, and it is especially one that concerns culture or history of a people, and it explains something of the natural or social phenomenon. Things are a certain way, and a myth tells a story of how they got that way. It may or may not be true factually, but it is true in that it explains why things are or how things came to be. That's a very simple understanding of myth. The Bible is full of them. The Bible is loaded down with myths. And in fact, the Bible starts with two of them. The very beginning of the Bible begins with one of hundreds, thousands of creation myths. There's a story that is told that explains why and how things are the way they are. Before I look at that, I want to read to you just a very simple quote. Many of you will know the name John Dominic Crossan. He says, before I start reading the first creation myth in Genesis, my point once again is not that those ancient people told literal stories and we are now smart enough to take them symbolically, but that they told them symbolically and we are now dumb enough to take them literally. These are symbolic stories. They are myths explaining how things are, how they came to be, and why things are. And so there are numerous creation myths. One of my favorites, anybody a Sturgill Simpson fan? Well, a couple of, probably 3 or 4 years ago at this point, Sturgill had an album out and there was a song on it that triggered something for me. The song is called Turtles All the Way Down. Tony knows, you know the song or you know the story? Okay, well, the myth, the way I most recently got it, and I've heard it several different ways over the years, was that William James was giving a speech, and he had a lecture on cosmology and the structure of the solar system. He's explaining all this in very scientific terms. And as he came to the end of it, he was accosted by an older woman. And she said, "Your theory that the sun is the center of the solar system and Earth is a ball which rotates around it has a very convincing ring to it, Mr. James, but it's wrong." "I've got a better theory," said the lady. "And what is that, madam?" inquired James politely. "We live on a crust of earth which is on the back of a giant turtle." I've heard this from one Indian nation. I've heard it different ways. Not wishing to demolish this absurd little story by bringing to bear the masses of scientific evidence that he had at his command, James decided to gently dissuade the woman and to make her see some of the inadequacies of her position. "If your theory is correct, madam, what does this turtle stand on?" "Ah, you're a very clever man, Mr. James, and that's a very good question," replied the lady, "but I have an answer, and it's this. The first turtle stands on the back of a second turtle, far larger turtle that stands directly under him." "Well, what does the second turtle stand on?" James asked. To this, the old lady crowed triumphantly, "It's no use, Mr. James. It's turtles all the way down." One after another. That's a myth. It sort of explains the world a little bit, but it's kind of a bad myth. I want to remind us again before I go farther what Crossan said. My point once again is not that those ancient people told literal stories that we're now smart enough to take symbolically, but that they told them symbolically and we are now dumb enough to take them literally. I want us to be more careful than that. And I want us to remind ourselves of how these myths were passed along. I'm going to read a Webster's Digest version of Genesis 1 in just a minute, just to hit the highlights real quick. But I'm reading. These stories originally were not read. These predate writing. These stories were told around campfires. They were told in tribal gatherings and community gatherings. These stories were told and passed and told and passed. And a little bit different here, a little bit different there. But at some point, an editor or a group of editors began to collect and write these down. And so when we get to the very first part of Genesis in our Bibles, this is a long ancient story that was originally told. Those of you who know me know I'm a storyteller. And so I like to picture, even though I'm going to read, because I didn't learn this well enough to just tell it. I am going to do some telling in a little bit. So, Webster's Digest version, which means day one. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was complete chaos and darkness and covered the face of the deep. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. Right off the bat. Light, darkness, day, night, the end of the first day, it was good. This morning, Neil and I, when we stay over at the beach, we go to the United Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ Church in St. Augustine. And I got their bulletin this morning, like we send ours out. I got their bulletin this morning, and they are looking at original blessing. So this story has something to say about original blessing, if you will. It was good. Day, night, good. Then day two, God separated the waters. Water in the sky, water on the earth. You may remember, if you've read this before, the word firmament or dome. This is very definitely a flat earth. If you take this literally, this would be a flat earth thing. Water above, clouds, vapor, water. There's no land yet, but that's day two. Day three, let the waters be gathered together in one place, and then let dry land appear. So now you've got water and land, and God says, it's good. And while we're doing that, God says, oh, let the earth put forth vegetation, plants, seed, fruit trees. And it was so, and it was good. Day four, God made two great lights. Great light to rule the day, the sun, and a lesser light to rule the night. And God looked at that and said, it's good. Day five, God created every living creature that moved except one kind. So you have the fish and the animals, the birds, every living creature that moves. God says, be fruitful and multiply, and it was good. You're getting a theme here? It was good, it was good, it was good. Then on day six, let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind. Every kind. And God said, it was good. Then God said, let us make humans in our image. Let them have dominion over everything. And humans were created in the image of God, male and female. And God blessed them. And it was good. And then on the seventh day, God rested. Now, this explains a lot. I mean, as a myth, it explains the world, how it got here, the sun, the moon. It actually, I skipped some parts, the stars, all the animals, all of that and human beings. It's a good myth in that it explains what is and how it came to be. But more importantly, or at least as importantly, is that blessing that was declared each step of the way. It's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's very good. Andy used to call this, Andy was the pastor you heard about who retired on us back in the end of April. He would always refer to this as the other church, original blessing. Earth and all that is created and it's good. That's a good myth. That's a good myth. It's followed immediately by another myth, and it's different. Second creation myth picks right up in I think it's the 4th verse of chapter 2. The order is completely different. Pretty much everything about it is different. Starts out, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. The day that God made the heavens and the earth, no plants yet, none of that stuff. No rain, water, stream would rise up from the earth. You notice that? There's no water yet except coming up, where the other one, water came first. And on that same day, the Lord God formed a man, from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. I notice that it does not say, and it was good. I just pulled a Chad, y'all. I dropped my nose. I hope I'm good. I'm still, yeah. And then God planted a garden. We all know the story. God planted a Garden of Eden in the east, and he put the man who informed them. Animals came. God let the man name the animals. Whatever the man named them, that's what they would be. I don't know how he came up with aardvark or rhinoceros, but whatever, that's what he did. He put the man in the garden and said, you can freely eat of every tree in the garden but the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day you eat it, you shall die. This is a creation myth, but it's trying to tell us something very different from the first story, right? It's telling us how things came to be and why things are, but it's a different understanding and a different way of coming at it. The man is in the garden. He's naming the animals, he's tilling the soil, or at least taking the crops. And the Lord God, by the way, that's a different language than the first story. First story, God, this one, the Lord God. That's one of the ways you know it's a different story from a different tradition being brought together. He says, this guy needs help. And so from the rib of the man, a woman was created. He brought her to the man at last. Bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, this one shall be called woman. And then it says something interesting. And the man and his wife were both naked. They're both naked. And the next phrase is, and not ashamed. I guarantee you, if I was standing in front of all y'all, no matter where I am, I'm going to be wearing clothes. Now, it might be different at the house from now, I don't know. Because if I'm naked, I'm not unashamed. I am thinking, that's a chunk of the story right there. There's now man and woman, and they're almost unself-aware. They're not worried about he doesn't worry about what she thinks, doesn't worry about what he thinks. None of that is part of this story. I have a picture of what takes place here. It has the man and the woman naked. I'm not going to show it. It also has the next part of the story, the serpent. I decided not to show it because both the man and the woman have navels. And if they were created out of the dust, there's no reason for them to have had navels. Just throwing that out there, y'all. Anyway, the man and the woman are both naked and they were unashamed. And the serpent, catches the ear of the woman. Did the Lord God tell you there was something you should not eat? She said, oh, we can eat anything in the garden except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Kitty, I am remembering the play that you wrote about this. Yes. You can eat any of that. She says, no, that's the one thing we can't eat. If we eat that, we die. And the serpent says, you won't die. You'll be more like God if you eat that. And the woman eats. She takes the fruit to the man. And he eats. And something changes. What's the first thing that happens? Anybody know? Yeah, suddenly they're not so unself-aware. They are very self-aware. They immediately cover themselves with fig leaves. Sew together fig leaves. Something changes. Something powerful changes there. Well, shortly thereafter, the Lord God comes down to the garden, as God is known to do each and every evening in the cool of the evening, to walk and talk with the man and the woman. And for the first time ever, they hide. When finally God speaks and the man finally steps up, and he's got on fig leaves. And God looks and says, did you eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? I want us to look at this word sin, because this story is what it's about. We're going to call the apex of this triangle where God is. Now we got the man down here, but I'm going to use him as an archetype of self. Mr. focused on himself. Mr. got his fig leaf on. He's not naked anymore. And then the woman is also in this story. And she can write better than I can. But God, self, and others. So God speaks to the man and says, did you eat the fruit? And what's the man's reaction? That woman. Now, this has been a harmonious relationship until this moment. Everything is good and square and balanced. Its life is good. That woman. And now the lines are fuzzed. That woman that you, God, put here. Now that line is fuzzed. That woman that you put here, she made me do it. God speaks to the woman. Well, the serpent implied that you put here and now the line is fuzzed. Sin, as this story tries to share with us, is here because it's here. And this myth simply affirms that it is here, but it begins to tell us something about it. Mr. Selfless, until this moment, is now self-focused. It's your fault, it's her fault, anybody's fault but my fault. Now, I know none of us have ever been like that. I think one of my favorite stories that I used to tell about this is my sister and I. My sister was a tattletale. I'll say it that way. And I was sneaky. And so my mom, we had an honest to goodness parlor at my house. We had a family room where we did many, many things. We had a basement where we did many things. We had a parlor where we didn't do anything unless company came. And in that parlor was always a candy dish. And I was pretty good at taking a piece of candy and fluffing up the rest of them so you couldn't tell one was gone. I was good at that. Not proud of it, but I was good at it. I went one night and slipped in to get a piece of candy, and my sisters came in and said, "You can't do that." And she swatted at the candy, but when she did, she hit the lid to the dish, and it was crystal, and it hit the table and it broke. And she looked at me and said, "This is your fault." And then she went and got a paper towel and a garbage can, and she swept the stuff right across the beautiful parlor table and just scratched the hell out of the top of it. She looked at me again and said, "This is your fault." I said, "It's not my fault." As soon as my parents got home, she got to them first. Danny was stealing candy, and he made me do this. It's his fault. And you shouldn't have candy in there anyway, Mom. Her fault. Sound familiar? Oh, but I had an answer. I was just getting a piece of candy. That's what it's there for. She's the one who swatted my hand. She's the one who broke the lid. And she's the one who scratched the table. It's her fault. You shouldn't have had her anyway. It's your fault. Don't we do this stuff? We get self-focused, and sometimes when we get caught up in our thing, our stuff, our way, we point the finger somewhere else. We become self-protected. And so this story kind of helps us see how that works. It's just explaining the way things are. It's a different story than the first one. First one suggests that the creation, as God put it here, is good. It's all here, all the pieces, things are working. The second one says, well, it doesn't always work just exactly right. I want to suggest to you, though, that sometimes we think of this and we're a little bit simplistic. I've got the man over here as self, I've got the woman over here as the other, I've got God up here, and that's all well and good and explains some things. But there's a fourth character in this story. And that fourth character I'm not saying the serpent. But that fourth character is creation. And that too is violated in this story. The word is there are things that are well and good to eat and to do, and there are things that aren't. Don't eat this fruit of this tree. And so that gets screwed up too. I've probably taught this in some minor form, fashion or another in a Bible study 100 times, but I've never thought until I came to UCG that there is that fourth character that we need to think about. Sin against creation, the gift we've been given. Now, we know that there are consequences to all that, but that's not really where we're going. The truth is, I wanted us to be thinking today about the understanding of myth. Myths are good, they are necessary, they are important, they are helpful. They're not necessarily, however, something we should take literally. They help us understand something. That first myth helps us understand the world, how things came to be. Now, there are literally hundreds of those. Some of my favorites come from Indian nations, indigenous peoples in the U.S., but almost every indigenous community the world over has its own creation myth. It's important. How the world get to be the way it is, there are fewer of those, but they're out there. But this is the one that those of us who grew up in church kind of got from the beginning. Nell and I have a place over in the St. Augustine area, which is a screw up of the name of St. Augustine. St. Augustine of Hippo. I know Tony has to leave, bless you. St. Augustine of Hippo took this story and said, well, now it's infected us all forever. And he took this and made it an archetype and said, well, he didn't even think about original blessing in the first story. He just said, once the first man and the first woman violated things, it tainted everybody forever. It's passed along from generation to generation. You are violated, you are corrupt because of this original sin. And that kind of permeated the church literally for centuries, coming out of the Catholic Church, but it permeated most churches. We're all sinners. Well, Scripture says we're all sinners. I am reminded of a story that I heard at a Baptist revival when I was a pastor in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. So I am a good ecumenical pastor. When something big is happening at one of the churches in the area, I would go, and the Baptist minister asked me if I would come to this revival they were having. They were having a former mob boss from Chicago who had been converted and was speaking, and he was going to come and preach for a week. And Dan, would you come one night? And so I said yes. And so I came. And you know, not only was he kind of a mob boss, but he at least hinted that he had been a hitman. So we're talking about a major conversion. And there's that word. So this guy, it's time for the altar call, where he's going to invite people forward to join the church and to declare their belief in Jesus and to be saved. That's a word we're saving for another time, saved for another time. But the guy is up there and he's getting ready to issue this altar call. And he said, I was doing this a few weeks ago at another church in a different place. And he said, I'm inviting people to come. And this lady comes forward and he says, now I'm going to ask each of you to confess that you are a sinner who needs the forgiveness of God through Jesus Christ. And there was a lady up there, probably 20 people, he said. There was a lady up there, and she looked increasingly uncomfortable as he was making his way down. And the pastor said, from the church, brought the evangelist over and said, you might want to be careful here. This woman is our biggest giver. He said, you see that big rose window? She gave that. And he said, you see the organ? She gave that. He said, and the grand piano, she gave that. He said, so be kind of gentle with her. So he's making his way down, and people are saying, I confess that I'm a sinner and that I need the Lord. And one after the other did it, and he got to her, and she paused, and so he skipped her, and the pastor came up and talked to her for a few minutes. And he worked his way down the aisle, and then the pastor nodded his head, and he came back and he said, are you prepared? And he said, will you confess that you are a sinner? And she says, yes, but I'm not a bad sinner like you. Well, he was, a Chicago mob guy. I mean, yeah, I'm not about levels of this, yes, maybe. It doesn't really matter if you're a good sinner or a bad sinner. It's part of who we are, but not because it's passed down. It's because we make choices like my sister and I made. It's her fault, your fault, anybody's fault but my fault. And we get self-focused. I think it doesn't matter. I've got statements from Judaism. I've got statements from Hinduism, from the Baha'i faith, from Islam, and from Christianity. All of them have some sort of understanding that sin, except for Buddhism, that sin is a part of the way the world is. It's just a piece of it. And it's just a reminder that we so often get self-centered and self-focused that we lose sight of the original balance that we are meant to have with others and with God. It's that simple. Sin is when we violate the relationship with creation, with others, with God, because we turn in on ourselves. All of those religions that I just mentioned have something to say about how we overcome that. Christianity certainly does. Judaism certainly does. Islam certainly does. We can talk about that some more. But this is why I didn't want Chad announcing what we were doing today. Because I figured if he said, oh, we're going to look at sin, nobody would come. So I think that's a stopping place for me. Are there things that you would like to play off of, challenge, ask, do anything before we break up? Let me see if I can find it. I hope I can.
If you restate her question, otherwise I'll take it. Oh, this is on. Is this my phone?
I think it is. I think it goes out.
Turn it back on. Otherwise, we try to get people talking to, because people that are on Zoom can hear. Otherwise, they can't hear from the audience. So, okay. So maybe restate that question and,
Sure.
or you want to re-ask it? Here we go.
Okay. On the Baha'i faith, what is their standpoint on sin as far as this issue is concerned?
Baha'i faith actually, while it's not coming out of that first story, but really is much more human beings are basically good. But it does recognize that we can turn toward God and we can turn from God. And so, but it really starts with that original blessing idea that you find in the first creation story, as opposed to what you find in the second creation story. Hang around there, John.
So this is being pulled from the Kitab Yaqtas, which is the Baha'i holy book, like the Bible is for Christianity or Gentiles.
It is remember I talked a little bit about Webster's Digest version. This is really much more of a Webster's Digest version from secondary sources, not which use that, but I'm not. Because I didn't have time to go back and read all the various scriptures from various things.
Celtic Christianity, of course, focuses, I think you already mentioned, on original blessing. So it lost out to Augustinian Christianity in what, 700, 900, many centuries ago, but we had the opportunity in Christianity to focus more on original blessing than happened.
There's lots of thoughts as to why. I know Kitty's about to ask something, so you might want to take the mic on. There's lots of thoughts about why Augustine won out, as opposed to the original blessing idea. They're both there, and their intention. I think we at UCG have leaned to that tension toward the original blessing, but recognize that we can get out of whack with creation and God and others. Yeah, Kitty.
It often sometimes not bothers me, but I question why is it we've got an odd number of days in a week? And I guess it all comes back to this. And I was wondering, do other civilizations that didn't come out of this have different times of, do they divide times up differently? In other words, we divide up times into, of course, makes sense, sunrise and sunset and all that, but why 7?
I think it's actually flipped. I think 7 had become a routine before the story was put down. It explains why it's 7. Doesn't really explain why, it just says it's 7. Yeah, Bill. That help, Kitty? I think Bill's about to answer that.
I suggest that the moon goes through a 28-day, and 7 is the highest, lowest prime number that goes into 28.
Well, there you go. You should have asked Bill. You should have asked Bill. He knows stuff. Anybody else? Anything?
One of the things that I don't know, many of you probably either read the book or watched the TV series of Joseph Campbell on the power of myth, and this idea that myths, while they're not factual, they have lots of truth within them. And I think it was in that program where someone asked a young girl, what is a myth? And she said, a myth is not something that's true on the outside, it's only true on the inside. And so when we look at the Bible, as you said, we should be looking for the truth and not get hung up on the myths.
And not get caught taking them literally. I do think, from my perspective, I need to be clear, from my perspective, that the cross-on statement. My point once again is not that those ancient people told literal stories and we're now smart enough to take them symbolically, but that they told them symbolically and we're now dumb enough to take them literally. These were symbolic stories told around the campfire, passed from generation to generation, altering a bit as they went until somebody finally put them down. The people who told them and the people who wrote them didn't really assume the world was created in 7 days. They're explaining something else. Now, I told you last time the tradition I came out of for a while in evangelicalism tends to take some branches of that, take these stories literally. I think if you hold them side by side, you can't. There's a different order to things. There's a different name for God in the two different stories. They're meant to be side by side and held in tension. And when we do that, we get shaped at different times in different ways.
Yeah, I think the other thing that always comes to me is if I look at Christ's teachings, the powerful truths were all in parables, which were stories. They were not factual. And so Jesus is using all these stories, made up things to make a point that has truth within it.
I went to the National Storytelling Conference in Jonesboro, Tennessee, a number of years ago, and a guy who was already my favorite storyteller, a guy named Donald Davis, told this incredible story. And I was staying with some friends, and there was a woman from my church and another pastor, and we were all staying at this house, and we heard this story. Donald Davis told this great story, and we got back to the house, and the woman who from my church who had gone said, "You think that story's true?" And knowing Donald Davis, I knew it at least mostly was. And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Now, you know, I was a news reporter. I mean something very specific by truth." And I looked at her and said, "That story's true, whether it ever happened or not." And she went, There's religious truth and there's news reporter truth. I'm reading Margaret Sullivan's behind the scenes book of a number of newspapers, but including the New York Times and the Washington Post right now. There's different kinds of truth. This is a kind of truth. It is religious truth. It is not factual news reporter truth, and it does not purport to be. And I'll leave that there. If anybody's got any other questions, I'm good, but we started late, and so we're ending relatively when we're supposed to, I think.
Thanks so much.
Yeehaw. Oh.
Well,